In this example, we're going to take a vector file. Using those vectors, we're going to look at various modelling tools. We'll be looking at the Create Shape tool, the 2-rail sweep, and the Extrude tool in order for us to create the components to create the finished composite model that you can see here. So let's just go to File, Close. So let's go and open an existing file. From the Fleur De Lys project folder, I'm going to bring in the Fleur De Lys vector file and press Open. So you can see that we have a set of vectors already created in our 2D view. And what we're going to do is we're going to create components from these vectors. In order for us to see the components, we need to look at the 3D view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the 2D view control and use the option to tile windows vertically. That way I can see the 2D view in the left and the 3D view in the right hand side. I can see that I have a gold coloured material block here. What I'd like to do is just alter that. So I'm going to come over to File Operations and use the option to set job dimensions and origin. So that will take us to our job setup form. You can see at the bottom we have the option to alter the appearance, and it's currently set to a solid colour. I'm just going to use the drop down menu. I'm going to change the appearance to be Canadian Maple. You can see instantly that's changed there in the 3D view. I'd also like to take this opportunity to just up the modelling resolution that I'm going to use. I'm going to set that to high. That should allow me to have more pixels to play with when I create models. So then I can press OK. As we already have our vectors drawn, I'm going to go to the bottom of the interface and switch from the Drawing tab to the Modelling tab here. And then here, this is where I can use the tools to create components from our vectors. Now before I go ahead and start modelling any components, I'd just like to think about my componentry and how I can organise it in advance. So the first set of shapes I'd like to create will form the base shape, so we're working from the bottom up. So we're going to create the base shapes first, and then we'll look at creating the Fleur De Lys afterwards. So to help myself, I'm just going to rename this level by right mouse clicking and saying rename level. I'm going to call that level base. So the first shape I'd like to create is the base shape, which is represented by this closed oval vector here. With that selected, we're going to go over to Create Shape from Vectors, and what this allows me to do is it allows me to assign a profile to a closed vector. We have 3 different profiles. We have this curved profile, we have an angular profile, or we could use a flat profile. Now in this example I want to go with a curved profile. Then we have the option to alter the angle of that curve. So if we put that in a view that we can see a little better, then I can look at maximising that up to 90 degrees. You can see that we're getting instant results in the 3D view there. Another way that I can alter the angle of the part is by specifying a value. So in here I'm going to put in a value of 20 degrees, spacebar to enter that in, and we can see it's created that rather shallow shape. We can see that there are lots of other different options and parameters that we can set to control the shape of the part. I'm happy with it as it is, so I'm just going to name that component. I'm going to call that base, and we can press apply, then I can close that down. So now I'll just put that back in Z, and so now we can see that component in the 3D view. We also have it represented by this grayscale in the 2D view, and we can also see that that's been added to our componentry. We can see the name of the component, we can see its combine mode is currently set to add. If I just wanted to undraw the visibility of the component, I can do so by checking this option here. And then to turn it back on, I just check it back. So the next component we're going to create is the border. We're going to use this oval vector here as a single drive rail, and what we're going to do is we're going to extrude this vector cross section here along the entire rail. So I'm just going to click in the white space to deselect that vector there. I'm going to come over to the modelling tools, We're going to create that shape by using this option here to extrude a shape using one or more centerline vectors. So let's go in there. The first thing we need to do is select our vector that we'd like to act as a rail, which is this one here. Then we have the option to use selection. So now we can select that, and that's transformed that vector into a drive rail. So let's move our way down. So now we need to select a cross section. In this instance, we're going to use a vector cross section. As I already mentioned, when using this one here, so I'm going to select this vector here. We'll work our way down. We don't want to weave. I don't want to scale that to an exact height. I'm just going to rename that component. We're going to call this component border. So I'm just going to type that in here, and then if we press apply, we can see that's been applied in the 3D view there. So let's just close that. We'll twiddle that to take a look at that, and we can see the shape of that cross section in our composite model matches the shape of the cross section vector that we used. So I'll put that in Z, and we can see that the border has also been added to our componentry. So now I have all of my components that form my base shapes. So I can come over to the componentry. I'm going to minimize the base level. I'm also going to switch that off, as I'm now ready to go and create my next set of shapes that will form the Fleur De Lys. So before I do that, I'm going to go and insert a new level. So I'm going to hover over the base level, right mouse click, and use the option to insert a new level. We can see it's inserted level 1. I'd like to rename that level, so I'm going to right mouse click, say rename level. I'm going to call that Fleur De Lys. Okay, and so because I know all the components I'm going to create next will form the Fleur De Lys, it's just a nice way of organising the parts so that they'll sit within the Fleur De Lys level. And it's good practice to name your levels, as it helps keep your componentry smart and organised. I can also see that the Fleur De Lys level is in blue, and it's also bold, so that's telling me that that is the active level. So any components that I create now will be added to this level here. Now before I go ahead and create the components that will form the Fleur De Lys, I just want to take a moment to discuss the vectors. Now if we zoom in on the 2D view, I'm going to do that by using the scroller of my mouse. I'm just pushing that away from me. If I have a look at this vector here, so this forms part of the side of our Fleur De Lys. You can see it's coming round and it's cutting in to the area that represents the middle of our Fleur De Lys here. Okay, so you can see we've got a crossover between the two there. And as we want the parts of the Fleur De Lys to sit next to each other, it's best that we do have this small overlap between the two vectors, as this will create a nice overlap between the two components than if we were to have two components that were created from vectors that are sat flush against each other. So I'm just going to come over here. I'm going to use this option to zoom to fit. You'll notice we don't have a vector that represents the right hand side of our Fleur De Lys there. And that's because we have the ability to mirror components. So we can just look at modelling one side and then look at mirroring the part. That way we're only working with as much as we need to. So now let's go and create the middle part of our Fleur De Lys. So we've got that vector selected. Let's go over to create shape from vectors. For this we're going to use a rounded profile. I'm going to give that an angle of 60 degrees. I'm going to call that middle, and I'm going to set that components combine mode to merge, so it merges with all of the other components that we're going to create within this level. So we'll press apply here, and we can see that's been added in the 3D view there. So we can close that, put that back in Z. And the next component I'd like to create is the side of our Fleur De Lys here. We can see we have two open vectors, and the reason for that is I'd like to model the side of our Fleur De Lys using the 2-rail sweep option, which is this option up here. So we're going to go into the 2-rail sweep. And so the two rail sweep allows us to create a shape that's defined by its vector rails and its cross sections. So in a similar fashion to the extrude tool, where we created the border using one single rail, we had the rail and we swept one shape along it, so the shape was determined by the cross section. In the two rail sweep, we can predetermine the shape of the part by creating the rails, in which a cross section is going to sweep from the start and end points of the two rails. So with that selected, I'm going to hold down Shift, select our second vector that we would like to use as our drive rails. Then we can use this option to use selection. So let's now change those vectors into drive rails. So we've got the shape of our part. Now we need to select a cross section that we'd like to sweep within that shape that we've got there. We'd like to use this cross section here, so I'm going to select that. I'm just going to press apply for the meantime. Then we can go ahead and take a look at the part in the 3D view. And so we can see the height of our cross section is being maintained all the way through. What I'd like to do is just alter that by coming over to the form and using this option to scale cross sections with width. And so what that's going to do, it's going to change the height of my cross section as it sweeps along depending on how wide the distance is between the two rails. So if I select that there and press apply, we can see that where the vectors get close together at these endpoints here, the part tapers down, and where the vectors are further apart, we have more height. Okay, so that's going to allow us to create more natural looking shapes. So I'm happy with that. If we just zoom in, we can see we've got something odd going on here where the two cross over. And that's because we've currently got our combine mode set to add. What I'd like to do is have the combine mode set to merge, so it's going to blend in with the middle component that we've got here. So if I select middle, we can see already that that's gone and we have a nice blend between the two. So I'm just going to rename that component. We're just going to call that side. I'm going to press apply, then close the form, and we'll just put that in Z. And so now I can look at creating a mirrored copy of the side component that we've just created. So I'd like to create a mirrored copy that's going to flip about the center point, which is here. So to do that, I'm going to select that component. We're going to go over to Transform Objects and use this option to mirror selected objects. Okay, so I'd like to flip that about the job center and I'd like to create a mirrored copy. I'm going to use the option to flip horizontal. We can see it, that's created that there for us. So I'm going to close that down. We can see it's also been added to our component tree. So now we're ready to go and create our final component that will form the tie area of our Fleur De Lys. So I'm going to select this vector here, hold down Shift, select this vector here. We have two open vectors, so I'm going to look at modelling this using the two rail sweep. Now I've already selected them. I can still go into the form and I can automatically use the option to use selection. That's now transferred those vectors into drive rails. So now I can go and select my cross section, which is this vector here. So I'm going to apply that to the start nodes. That's going to run from the start of each of those rails to the end point on the right hand side here. I don't want to scale cross sections with width, as I'd like to maintain the height of the vector that I've got here. So I'm going to uncheck that option. I'd like to merge that component with everything else, and I'm going to rename that component and call that tie. We'll press apply and then take a look at that in the 3D view. So you can see that tie isn't completely clearing the left and the right side of our Fleur De Lys, and it's not clearing the centre point either. So what we need to do is look at adding additional height in the central area here, and we can do that by adding in another cross section. So I'm going to look at using this cross section here. We can see in comparison to the original vector we had sweeping through those two rails, there's a lot more height involved in this one. We also have a nice dipped area at the top here. So I'm going to select that vector and I'm just going to come over to the rails. We can see that there's a tick, so it's allowing me to apply that cross section to our rails. So I'm going to put that in like so. If I zoom in, we can also see that everything's colour coordinated. So you can see that there is a red node on our smaller cross sections, which we can see on the ends there. And then we have a yellow node on our larger cross section, which we can see in the middle there. So that's helpful. So now if I press apply, you can see it's made those changes there. It's completely clearing the centre and the sides of our Fleur De Lys. So I'm happy with that. We'll put that in Z, and then we can close the form down. And so now we have our complete Fleur De Lys. But just taking a look at that, if I just zoom in the 3D view, we can see I have quite squared edges on our tie there. What I could do is just look at giving that a little smooth over using the sculpting tools. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to come over to the modelling tools and use the option to sculpt. So in here we have various tools. What I'd like to do is just look at smoothing this part. So I'm going to use the smooth option. I'm just going to bring the diameter down to around 50 and keep the strength at around 9. We don't want to apply too much strength. You can see at the moment my cursor is blue. That means I'm not doing anything. The moment I click on the left mouse button, that means that I'm actually applying the smoothing. Okay, we can see that all I'm doing is just going around, and that's just smoothing that off for me. So it's like smoothing virtual clay. So I'm happy with that side. So I'm just going to go into the twiddle view and then just move my modelling plane around, then go back into the smooth, and then I'm just going to apply the same on this side here. So now we have nice smooth edges there. So we'll say keep and OK that. Just put that in Z, and I'm going to switch to my 2D tab, and then we're going to use the option zoom to fit. Now I'd like to take a moment just to discuss the componentry. So I'm just going to minimise the Fleur De Lys level, and I'm also going to switch that off. I'm going to switch on our base level. I'm just going to maximise the 3D view. And so the base level is currently set to add. And this is the first level in the composite model, and its combine mode is acting from the modelling plane. Therefore it's generally set to add to begin with. If we take a look at what's within that first level, you'll remember we created the base shape first, followed by the border. So we're working from the bottom up, and so our base shape is also adding from this modelling plane here. And then we have the border, which is adding on top of our base shape. And so what's happening here is the pixels in each of these components are being added together to push the Z heights up. And so it's a combination of the shapes stacked up. If I come round and right mouse click on the border component and set the combine mode to merge, we can see that it's blending in with the base component. And so what it's doing, it's only keeping the highest pixels from each of these components as to what it displays in the 3D view. And so we can see the rest of our border component is hidden away, and we can see that area represented by this highlighted green colour here. And what I'd like to do is actually have this border component adding on top of our base shape. So I'm going to go back in and then change the combine mode back to add. So it's sitting proud and prominent on top of that base shape. So I'm happy with that. We'll put that in Z. So let's work our way up the component tree. So after we created the base shapes, we then went on and created a level called the Fleur De Lys, ready for us to create the components for the Fleur De Lys itself. So let's switch that level on, and we'll also open that out so we can see all the components inside. So we can see we have a series of components that are all merging with each other. So they're all blending into each other to create the part that you can see here. The level itself is set to add, so everything within this level is ultimately going to add on top of the base shape. So it's going to sit nicely on top of the base shape like we've got here. So let's just minimise those levels there. I'd just like to make one more adjustment, and that's just stretching the middle component down a little. Now I can do this in the 3D view, so I'm going to select that middle area, I'm going to select that again to put it into transform mode. I'm just going to pull on this area here, pull that down to stretch the shape out. We can see it's created those changes there. I'd also like to now move the sides and the tie down a little, just so it sits in a little better with the middle shape. So I'm going to select the side, hold down Shift, select the tie, and still holding down Shift, I'm going to select the right hand side. I'm going to select them to put it into transform mode. I'm going to hold down Shift, and then that means that when I move the part, it's going to stay in line either vertically or horizontally. So holding that down, we can see it's just staying in line there, and then I can look at positioning that. That's too far down, I think, so I'm just going to move that up a little, and I'm happy with the way that that looks. So we can come out there, and so that really finishes this tutorial. Where we started with a vector file, we're using those vectors, we looked at various different modelling tools in order for us to create the part that you can see here. We looked at the create shape tool, the 2-rail sweep and the extrude tool in order for us to create this complete Fleur De Lys model. So at this stage it's a good idea to go ahead and save the file. So we'll go to File, I'm going to go to Save As, and then from the project folder we're just going to call that Fleur De Lys model. Then press Save, and then you can access that from the project folder.